Now, let me go further to break down some of the points that Odiaofemu made in that speech. What Odiaofemu referred to as the first coup in Nigeria was the failure of Nnamdi Azikiwe to rally the military to his side during the 1964 election crisis. In the battle of supremacy with the Prime Minister, Tafawa Balewa, Zik had thought that as the President and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, that the military would take orders from him. But this was not to be, as the then colonial head of the army, Major General Welby Everard, was legally advised to take the side of Tafawa Balewa, forcing Zik to renege on his well-published stance that he will not call on Balewa to form a new government after the severely flawed 1964 election. In that speech by Odiaofemu, you heard that Balewa ordered the army to arrest Zik. It was a house arrest. He couldn't come out, and he was forced to write another letter to say, okay, I will now call a government. I want to read from a book. That's the last book we'll be reading for this edition of the program. I want to read from this book, Emeka. Emeka is Ojukwu's first name. Emeka. I want to read from this book. Emeka Ojukwu. This book is written by Frederick Forsyth. It is one of the best biographies on Odumegwu Ojukwu. So let's read from page 40 to 42. It's about the same story. Frederick Forsyth says Nigeria's president was by then an Easterner of NCNC party. Although a non-executive president, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe was also holder of the title of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. But the democratically elected government was of the MPC, headed by Alhaji Tafawa Balewa, under whom the defense minister was Alhaji Ribadu. In the event of a political crisis and in the event of conflicting orders from the president and the prime minister, whom should the army obey? Forsyth asked in the book. No one knew, he says. No one had the faintest idea, he continues. No one had ever thought of it before. They agreed that Emeka Ojukwu should find out exactly where they all stood, and as quickly as possible. Ojukwu resolved to consult the British general officer commanding, General Welby Everard. At this time, Ironsi was not the leader of Nigeria's army. It was when Everard led that he handed over to Ironsi. Frederick Forsyth in this book said, but before Ojukwu could do so, Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, who had attended the meeting and said nothing, eager as ever to seek favor with the British, something that still continues today, had run to General Welby Everard with a story that Emeka Ojukwu was holding political meetings. Can you see this? Gowon was in that meeting when Ojukwu was sent to go and ask Everard, who would the army obey? But before Ojukwu could get to go where Everard, Gowon had run to go and say, see, Ojukwu had called a political meeting, he's planning something. Tawa, you would say, human being and conflict. Okay, let's continue reading. So the general summoned Ojukwu and asked him what he was up to. Emeka replied that he would be delighted to explain, but that he wanted the same group of officers he had already spoken to be present at the meeting. The general agreed, and the officers were summoned. Emeka Ojukwu went through it all again. When he had finished, General Welby Everard was lost in thought. "You are right," he said to Ojukwu. "I don't know the answer. It never occurred to me. But why didn't you come to me first?" Ojukwu replied, "Because this is a Nigerian affair, and you are a British officer first. If the worst comes to the worst, the British High Commission may order you to stand aside. That would leave us not knowing which way to go. We have to know." Welby Everard admitted that if ordered to stand aside, he would obey his British orders and do so. He promised the officers he would consult the country's senior legal officer, the Attorney General, for a ruling. Then he rounded on Gowon and ticked him off for spreading alarmist rumors. As they left the meeting, Ojukwu asked Gowon why he had considered it fit to go running to the general with his tales. Gowon mumbled that he was sorry, but he did not understood what Emeka was talking about. Jack, Ojukwu used to call Gowon Jack. Even in Aburi, he called him Jack. So Ojukwu said, "Jack, the next time I say something that you don't understand, would you mind coming to me to ask first?" So the general consulted the Attorney General and got the ruling. It was clear, in the event of conflict, the officer corps should obey the democratically elected political leader of the country, the Prime Minister, or his subordinate, the Defense Minister. Remember, I'm reading from the book Emeka, written by Frederick Forsyth. It's the biography of Emeka Odumegwu Ojukwu. Frederick Forsyth is a British journalist. Yes, as I conclude, it was clear, in the event of conflict, the officer corps should obey the democratically elected political leader of the country, the Prime Minister, or his subordinate, the Defense Minister. The worst did not come to pass that winter of 1964, but it did 14 months later, in January 1966, with the president out of the country, the Prime Minister dead, but his body not discovered, and the Defense Minister unable to be found. General Nronsi, in those confused days, followed the ruling of 1964 by consulting the most senior ranking minister, Alhaji Deep Charima. So let's leave that story at that point. You can get this book on udarabooks.com. Look at it. Emeka, classic. Get some books and read. Do we still have libraries? These books should be in our libraries so that we can read and understand where we are coming from. So having read the story from Emeka, you find this book on udarabooks.com. udarabooks.com. And you can also get them or get the book through our WhatsApp numbers. The numbers are on the screen. So contact us on WhatsApp and get your copy. I have laid the groundwork for the discussion of Aburi in the next edition of the program. This is part 1. Let Professor Egosa Osagai speak to the point made by Odia Ofemu. Both of them were in that conference. So after the Alfemus spoke, Egosa Osagai came to play the devil's advocate. You know, what is called counterfactual in scholarly discourse. So let's listen to Professor Egosa Osagai. Remember him? He is presently the Director General of the Nigeria Institute of International Affairs.
There is something I see here from our old teacher also, Professor Billy Dudley. Billy Dudley was, in his 1972 book, making a strong case in the introductory pages, talking about what might have been counterfactual. His simple question was, it is true Nigeria has had all of these problems, but is it possible that a country like Nigeria would have been created without the British intervention? I mean, think of that for a minute. Because many times we say Nigeria is a colonial mistake. They talk about the mistake of 1914. Now, Dudley was simply saying that he thinks that we had sociological and economic linkages amongst all of these groups in Nigeria that would possibly suggest, counterfactually, that if the British didn't come, something close to Nigeria may still have been created. We cannot argue for or against a counterfactual, but it's quite plausible. It's quite plausible because, you know, if you go inside the walled city of Kano, you will find Yarubawa quarters. And that's not a colonial creation. It's been there. I mean, the Nupes that found their way to Lagos, today we are celebrating Lagos at 50, those Nupes who came can claim the indigeneity that every person else is claiming in Lagos. It's the same thing in Port Harcourt. The Jaws are everywhere. Wherever you find water, you will find the Jaws. And they say they are the only group in Nigeria without any myth of having come from somewhere else. They probably came with water. So, I mean, that's the Nigerian narrative. That's the counterfactual. You know, that's one. The second thing is when we heard here that in 1959, when you needed a coalition, perhaps the NCNC was told that this is the better way to tread. Now, Dudley has a different perspective. He talks about William Riker's theory of the minimum winning coalition, which is rational behavior. But he says, if you were simply being rational and you wanted to maximize the spoils of office, then the NPC was the most unfavored coalition partner. But in the event, it was the AG and the NCNC that had the coalition. And the justification for that coalition was provided. Well, the justification was provided by no less a person than Nnamdi Azikiwe himself. He had what Dudley refers to as the aspectival preferences and the synoptic preferences. Aspectival saying, look, we have looked at the chemistry and the arithmetic, and we have seen if we go into coalition with the action group, perhaps the guys in the Western region are higher than us in many respects, so we cannot maximize the spoils. So why not go with a partner that has the numbers, but not the qualitative, competitive status? That was aspectival. But the synoptic was no less important. He said, if we have an AG-NC-NC coalition, we would exclude the North. And for a very young country, that's not something that is likely to take us far. Now, we can go back and say, maybe they didn't know what they were doing. But those were weighty considerations at the time, but especially the synoptic preferences.
State Affairs with Edmondo Bilo is live.
Awolowo saga there. Interesting. Awolowo saga is a professor of political science. He's a former vice chancellor of Igbinedion University, Okada. I recommend one of his books to you, entitled Nigeria Since Independence, Crippled Giant. Crippled Giant. It's one of the best books to read on Nigerian history. You see this? Crippled Giant. Get a copy of this book. You would love it. It's on udarabooks.com, a book written by Awolowo Sagai, the Director General of the Nigeria Institute of International Affairs. Quality work. Lovely books. I love reading. I love research. So I read, and I read. As I read, I write. Are you ready to read my book? Yes, you should be ready to read my book. My book will be on your table soon. Read history. So I bring this book to you, Crippled Giant, Nigeria Since Independence, written by Awolowo Sagai. Get it on udarabooks.com. There's a book I've been looking for, but I'm so happy. Recently, we found it. I call this the best diary on the Nigerian Civil War. Look at this big book. It is the best diary. I call it a diary. You know, it's not somebody telling a story. No, it's a different book on the Nigerian Civil War. It's not somebody telling his own story. You know, documentations of the different reports by New York Times, who said what. This book, if you are a researcher on Biafra and the Nigerian War, you should have this book by Dr. Luke Nnaemeka Anele. We are happy we found it. We've been searching for it. You know what we are doing in Udara Book? We are searching for every book on Nigerian history, and we are bringing them to you. Though most of these books are out of print, but even if they are old, we will find them. Even if it's 2 copies. But luckily, we got more than 50 copies of this. I'm so happy that this book is finally on Udara Bookstore. I'm going to review this book someday. I'm just bringing it to you. Remember, we are discussing Aburi Accord. But if you go on my pages, on YouTube, on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook, on X, you will see the discourse on Nigerian history. So you can get this book. It's entitled The Untold Story of the Nigerian Biafran War. A chronological reconstruction of the events and circumstances of the war. You know, day by day analysis. Anti-Erosin demonstration spread in the north. May 28, 1966. You turn to this page. May 28, 1966. Temporary calm in the north. Press censored. You now go again. Daily Times appears with blank front page. On May 29, 1966, text of a government broadcast. It's such a quality work. It makes me happy. I love this book. I love this book. I found it at last. You know, I bought a copy 10 years ago. This copy, I bought it 10 years ago. But since Udara Book came on, we'll be looking for the book. Luckily, I found it. And we have mopped it. Get your copy on udarabooks.com. Yes, as we go, I can see I'm on YouTube now. Mao Pego Guni, thank you for joining the broadcast on YouTube. I'm happy. Ivan Green, he said, thank you, Mr. Edmond. God will surely continue to bless you and continue to enrich your knowledge and wisdom. This is truly educational and knowledgeable piece of work. Thank you, Ivan Green. Thank you. I'm happy you enjoyed the broadcast. Ifeanyi Eziala is on YouTube. He says, you are doing the hardest, most difficult, inevitable program in the Nigerian state. Hey, you they blow my head. Thank you. I appreciate it. Joseph Igodalo. Just like what Fulanese are still doing now, they see that the desolation of Nigeria is inevitable. The reason they are transporting their population with arms to the rest of the country. That's your analysis. Oyelami Babajide says, thank you, Radio Man, for enlightening us on history. Keep up the wonderful job. Thank you. Thank you. GIS for Africa says, top content from an outstanding class. Thank you. Thank you for appreciating the class. Thank you. Yomi Olorunfemi says, good job, Radio Man. Joining you from Edmonton. Yomi, how is Edmonton, Canada? Happy that you listen. Thank you. DG Ajibola says, thank you very much. Insightful. This is part 1. Join me for part 2 on Wednesday.